Started so we can fall further behind as we go through.
Nowhere fails. You know how that's going.
All right. I sat there, wasn't sure if I was going to be able to make it this year, and then when I turned on, okay, I knew I was going to be able to come, I started talking to Lewis and said, okay, well, I should do a presentation, what do you think would be a good one? Because, I don't know, at this point, most of my stuff's been said enough times that, what would be a good presentation? He said, well, why don't you go over some of the things that you've done? And I got to think about this, is, there is something, to do with that, is that what I wanted to look at is, these are just some of the things, a few of the things, and I'll be going through them. And what I wanted to look at is that, and I've seen, I had this idea, and then I saw Paul's presentation, or at least an early one of it, and his it's got a lot of the same ideas, and he said, well, you know what, it's not a bad thing for both of us to kind of emphasize this. So as I go ahead and continue with the idea I had here, and this Trigon disk utilities, that's one of the very first things I put out on it's out on Hobbs, and Trigon is it just deletes a tree, directory tree. Now, the ones I found up to that point, you had to sit there and say, yes, I'm sure, yes, I know I want to delete. Please just delete the whole blasted tree. And so I said, you know what? I want to have a thing that says, what? Says, are you sure you want to do this? Yes or no? Yes, and he goes through and it's gone. He goes through and gets rid of, read-only attributes and whatnot, and just goes through. And I didn't want to have to sit there and keep saying, yes, I know what I'm doing. Like I put in warning on the thing, says, you better know what you're doing, because it's gone. But I got tired of having to sit there and say, yes, I know what I'm doing. EMX installer back in earlier days of Odin and Mozilla was using, after they started using 3.2.1 before the 3.2.2 was completed for Mozilla. And Odin originally was using some 3.2.1 stuff. And so I went ahead and built an installer, installed GMX base, and then applied all the different stuff to it, including the 3.2.1 update. And it's out there on Hobbs, and so you can sit there and just have the entire EMX suite installed for you right there in one shot. Like I said, I've done a little bit of Odin stuff. I'm not big programmer in it, but I've done a few things in Odin. Mozilla, Rdesktop. I did one of the ports that's out there on Rdesktop. Associo-Edit. I've done some updates on it. D-Windows, a few little, most of the make files I'll get into that. Done a little bit of work with Union. I'm not a device driver programmer. I don't think in those terms, but I've done a little bit of work with Union. Built the HLT driver. Did some work on the Print 01. That was a little bit with the USB, L switcher, and a mouse. And there's others out there. Before I started, those put in my experience: Basic, eBase 2, Pascal, C, Fortran. It looks like I've got a lot of experience there. Now, that Basic started when I was 10 years old on a TRS-80 back in 1980. Also, then later at the last half of my senior year in high school, did Basic then on a Mac. eBase 2 was my junior year of high school. First half of came in 2 weeks late, and then the last half of that semester, the second semester, did Pascal. That's spelling right there, but did Pascal. And about the only thing it is, we ended up, there was 3 of us, instead of going to eBase 3, we went and did Pascal because they said it's not worth y'all spending your time on that. So we decided to put us over on the other. C, I took C in college, and I ended up, I can't remember if I dropped it or failed it the first time I was taking it. When you've got an instructor, you're trying to learn a new language from somebody who doesn't speak your language, it's a little bit difficult. And so the first time I didn't do that well. Second time I ended up with a C, and that was somebody who did speak the English. I just didn't, I just didn't do it all that well with it coming off of basic, trying to learn to pass the C. I didn't do all that well. Now the Fortran, the only reason I took Fortran, I was an electrical engineering major. Didn't have to take Fortran. But a lot of my friends were chemical engineering, going through chemical engineering, and they were taking the Fortran. And I was like, I was sitting there helping them with their Fortran stuff. I didn't know the syntax at all, but I could sit there and look at it and say, well, why are you doing that here and that not, why is it changed over there? And so I got some interest in it and went in and took actually I think it was probably, at that point still probably took a quarter of Fortran. And the Rex basically goes back, I started playing with that a little bit, and that's what those Trigon disk utilities is. And like I said here, so the Trigon disk utilities, and it's got actually, Trigon is the main one that I still use at this point. It actually has, there's Trigon itself is actually out on the, as a separate utility out on Hobbs, but it also has the disk utilities, which also includes the Trigon. The other ones that are in there is a deal that will open up a folder. So if you just type in OT, it opens up the folder you're in. Or you can type in OT and then give it the path, and it'll open up, the path. In the icon view. Then I also wrote another one that allows you just to change directories, because before I started using 4OS2, you're using the command and you try to change over to another drive or something, and it just wasn't there. So I wrote I had a little script that does that all for you. At this point, the main one I'm still using is the Trigon, because I don't need, I use OT occasionally still, but now I've got CDD inside of 4OS2, and I just use that one. But those are, like I said, those are my earliest ones. That was back in, I went out there and checked their dates, were 98. And they're just simple little scripts, and probably unknown and unused by anybody but me. But I put them out there back at that point. The next thing I really, as far as contribution-wise, was in my book. And I put in there GCC, but actually I meant to put back days. I started back in building it when it was still using the VAC compiler. It was when I first started building it. And then they decided they were going to be moving to the GCC. And the GCC, they knew it was building the 322 compiler, and they knew they were doing that, so they started moving over before he was completed. They went over to 321. And I was working with Javier Piedmont, helping him set up that build environment. Just, something that's interesting to do. And then a few things I've done. I've done little bits in there. The biggest things I've done was the Sunbird. And that took me days and days and days getting that built. For a few lines in a make file that when I got the thing built, I sent it over, and none of that got put in there because, well, Mike Catlin had a much better way of doing it. He figured out in like 2 minutes, But that was the first one to get the Sunbird built. And I just kind of prodded him to go ahead and put it in and do it, in a better way. But it takes me days and days. And I'm expecting, actually thinking, okay, I'm going to get in there and I'm going to do some real, figure this stuff out. Thinking in terms of learning the C and stuff. No, it's all make file. The stuff that I actually knew very little about, because in my C courses I didn't have to do make files. So this was all, totally new. So, it was all the stuff that I didn't know anything at all about. It took me days and days. And the other piece was the high mem, and I marked the clipboard because I found out that you can mark the clipboard high, but if you mark the clipboard high, then it doesn't paste into certain things. Now you paste into something else, which then moves it low, and then you can paste into those other things. But that's actually not marked. It's one of the few things that's not marked as high inside with the high mem. But I went through and did a bunch of that, and then it was actually a Warpstock in 2005, I believe is what it was done. It was in Hershey, I think it was 2005. I was sitting there trying to figure out why the thing would crash. You know, there was a certain crash in it going high, and Newt was at that Warpstock, and so he looks at it, oh, it's, okay, now we know. And so that's when we got the high mem support actually fully implemented into Mozilla. All right, Yoden, like I said, it's small updates here and there. Mostly I pulled the stuff from line, build fixes here and there. 132K had a small issue at one point because Newt had figured that you put a sanity check in there and said, well, if this number's too high, then there's something wrong. Well, that number was the number of build revisions, and we passed that build revision. So it's it's a simple thing. So, all right, so I was talking about the EMX installer. I can't remember if I initially built it because of Odin using it or Mozilla using it. Odin only used it for a few things, but there was something it was using for, and I don't remember what it was. Originally, it was only using it for one small section. I don't know, it's been too many years ago to remember what it was. Mostly it was at that point still using VAC for everything. There was one section, as I recall, that it was using, I think some stuff it pulled specifically over from the line. And like I said, it's around the same time frame that Mozilla was switching over, and I might have built it because of that. I can't remember. It was, I just wanted to have an easy way for people to be able to install this EMX installer, because everybody kept talking about how difficult it was to do. And yes, I probably could have built it as a warp in, but I needed the regs better, so I built the reg script to improve the process. All right, the Rdesktop. The primary reason I built that one is because I needed clipboard support in the Rdesktop. The current ones out there did not have it because I think those versions previously didn't have it. I think the version that I ported was the first one that had the clipboard support in Rdesktop. The licenses bit there is that I didn't really care about licenses at the time. And I think the licenses that I used were, pull in some other stuff were probably compatible, but I wouldn't swear to it. But I think they were MIT licensing that I pulled over, so I think they were probably fine in the code it was going into. But, basically there was a few pieces here and there that, I had to pull in from somewhere, and I did that. But most of the stuff I just built. I mean, I was using X386 and EMX, and this, the libs there from the X386 and the EMX all just built, everything just built fine, except for a few pieces here and there that were missing that I had to pull in. Socio-edit, those were probably altogether 3 to 5 lines of code that had to change. There was an overflow that caused your associations just not to show up, and it was because of used a PFN instead of, I can't remember now. It just needed to be a larger type system. And then there was a deal where, and to be honest with you, I don't even remember some of this exactly what it was. But he complained of invalid executables, and you had dots in the names. Or too many dots. Yeah, and so went in there, found where that was at. And it was, just a couple of changes. In fact, I think that might have even been a typo.
It's probably a one-liner.
Yeah.
Because that's a classic thing. Remember we had that problem with the WPS too.
Yeah.
Where basically it was using the equivalent in SeaWorld of the steer pods rather than steer R pods.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't pick up the last dot, you pick up the first one, and maybe even if you're really unlucky, you pick up the dot in the path.
Yeah.
It would be really confusing.
D-Windows. Now D-Windows is, I'm not sure what it's similar, I guess, and it's similar to Qt in that it's just that it's natively got OS2, Mac, Linux, I remember Windows. We built thing with all of them in mind. My mind's drawn blank. Brian Smith, I think, is the one who's doing that. I also call it dynamic windows. I believe dynamic windows is where the D comes from. But I got interested in that. He's got an FTP client built off of it, and a couple of different things. It's a really interesting library. I wish there was a few more things using it out there. But it's not that big. It's fairly powerful across, like I said, across many platforms. But and initially he was trying to build a thing with VAC and Wacom both, but he had problems with the Wacom builds, and so I went in there and just found what was causing the build errors he was having, and just cleaned those up, and then some various warnings, and then also out there on the OS2 builds. Uniod, I've done a little bit of work with the Uniod here and there. Started that around the same time that, now my mind's going another blank. Can't think of the fellow that started updating the port, doing the first update of the port coming over. Brendan. Yeah. Brendan. So about the time about that same time is when I kind of got an interest in that. And it's mostly just trying to find, the build issues here, and getting compiler, things, compiling. The virtual PC is probably the biggest thing that I've taken time working on is that the Uniod currently is not working with virtual PC for sound. So I sat there and went through it, but at one point it was, and it wasn't. So I would go through and I'd start doing reversing it, pulling this out, pulling that, and backing out until I found where it broke at. And then once I found where it broke at, I started sitting there saying, okay, now what has to happen? And basically there's some code in there for when you have certain small buffers. And it starts trying to manipulate that somehow or other. And that somehow or other I'm not sure about. But what I was able to do is look and see that, okay, if you take that back out, if it's between this size and this size, don't do the thing that they're wanting to do to it, and it goes back to working again. David hadn't put that fix in there. Well, I shouldn't call it a fix. That workaround in there is a better way of saying that. Hadn't put it in, but he also hadn't had time to go in there and figure out what the actual problem, fix is. Yeah. I kind of wish you'd just go ahead and put the workaround in there until.
First things first. Right now, when it hits the top of the pile again, Uniod is going to get restructured much in the same way that ACPI got restructured.
He's done a lot.
So that we can drop in new Uniod sources without massive amounts of effort every time.
Yeah.
Like right now, if you look at ACPI, David has just about zero work to drop in the new ACPI core because things are the way they should have been to begin with.
Yeah.
And it's just a lot easier.
Yeah. But that's the biggest thing I've done there. It's just a function of going through and slugging your way through it.
Yeah. Well, I sort of hope to get to that position when Brendan was working on it, but sort of, it's like everything happens, people get busy and do other things, and that effort really fizzled out before the resync really was completed.
Yeah. All right, now this here is an interesting one that came up, HLT driver. Now, the HLT driver...
What is that?
Basically, if you see out there on the ECOM station, they've got the SMB kernel, 14105 SMB kernel that says it's been patched for HLT, adding HLT. Now HLT is a halt command for the processor. Basically, it just allows the processor to go to sleep while it's not doing anything else. And they apparently patched the kernel to add it. Now my problem was I put that kernel on there and my system just it died. It wouldn't run with that kernel. But without that HLT, the thing was running fast and hot all the time. So I said, well, a driver is supposed to be able to let you do basically anything the kernel does, just as a driver. So I said, well, why couldn't I create a driver for the HLT? It turns out it's actually relatively simple. What I did is went out and found a Hello World driver, had a few bugs in it here and there, but not bad, and fixed the bugs and went in there and added basically just a ASM call to HLT and let the thing call it. Now then I figured out, okay, now I got to have somebody to call the driver, which like I didn't really know much about drivers, still don't know a whole lot, but I didn't realize that until I got the thing built. If you ever looked at a Windows machine and you do a task manager, and you see this thing at the top that says it's using 99% of your CPU, but it says it's system idle. Basically, it's the same thing that I ended up having to write here. The difference is that their system idle, it says system idle 99%, but your CPU usage is like 0 or 1 or whatever. Mine, because the CPU meter doesn't know that what it is it's using, it just says that your CPU is using 100% CPU. But basically, I had to write a loop to call in the driver and just a close loop. I tried to put a sleep in there so that it'd go away, but as soon as you put the sleep in, it's not calling the HLT up enough to make it worthwhile to have you doing it at all. So it has to be a tight loop in order for the thing to call that HLT. There is somebody, and at this point it's not really, I didn't think it had any real point anymore since David added the HLT into the ACPI. But there's somebody that actually picked it up, and I couldn't tell exactly what he changed to make a difference, but he changed it so it works with OS2 1.3. So.
Now, is he actually running on it? The only thing that's really going to help for is SFP kernels, because my understanding is the Warpstock kernel does do the haul.
Yeah, but this is 1.3.
The thing that's weird is I have never been able to understand why the SFP kernel doesn't do the haul too.
Yeah.
Inside the kernel, because maybe, just here's my theory on this, maybe they assume, because there's a lot of stuff about SFP that's not really documented, but maybe they assume that the PSD would do it, which is exactly what happens right now, because what happens right now is when the kernel decides that a processor is idle, it tells PSD to go idle, and it does.
Yeah.
Now there's the halts that are there, and it happens in the PSD. But I suspect the person who's used that halt driver is not using an up-to-date PSD.
Well, like I said, it's actually, I think he's using an OS2 1.3.
Yeah.
So,
but again, that would have to be, again, on Warp 1.3, it doesn't much matter.
This is pre-Warp. Warp didn't come until OS2 1.3.
Yeah, but they never even had SMP for that. He must have, he's having fun, basically. Yeah. And they also, they need that the 1.3 doesn't have.
The HLT,
The halt thing, it's old enough, but they not. Yeah.
But for the halt, wasn't a kernel patch necessary in memory, or was it for
There's a
something?
lot of different ways of doing it. If you think about it, if you don't have a PSD, you don't have much choice but a kernel patch.
No, I'm just saying, but now we have a PSD. ACPI does it.
Oh, yeah. But don't forget, it took a while before we actually got a PSD that was a stable PSD.
No,
The PSD you have now compared to what we had, like, pick 314 and stuff like that, it's a different animal.
No, I'm just saying, currently the PSD use is restricted to a couple of kernels because they are patched in memory, as far as I remember.
No.
Not anymore?
Well, it's a matter of support.
Okay.
There are some patches, but I think, David sort of, he's an engineer, a black and white engineer. And me, I would just complain and say, hey, you're running this on an unsupported kernel. But since he's the guy who's got responsible for code, he simply only will run on the stuff he supports. So, but there's no reason why you couldn't use an older kernel. You might not get a patch, and it might not work right because it's not fully tested. But there's no functional reason it can't work.
My question was heading in the direction that if OS2 was, or if they expected the PSD to handle the halt feature, then you wouldn't need it. In-memory code.
My theory that the intention was that any halting on the SMP kernel would be done by the PSD. In other words, that's why the kernel doesn't do it.
So the OS2 APIC, for instance, may do it. I don't know if it does, but
Yeah, it might. Yeah, we don't know because we don't really have that code. And this just gets into basically not publicly documented material. I am sure there's a spec inside of IBM that explains somewhere why things are the way they are. Because they didn't just sit down and write code. It's just too complex for that.
No.
But, you know, the code, it's just not publicly, it never made it outside of IBM.
Okay.
Now this over here says, I asked if you've worked given that why patch the kernel if the driver can do it? Roger did ask me, because when I was building the thing, Roger's like, well, why would they have patched the kernel if you can do it as a driver? I don't know.
Yeah.
I guess because they could. I mean,
there's always many solutions to a given problem. Some are righter than others.
yeah. But basically, I mean, the driver, you know, you drop it in there, and you know, I said, well, why couldn't you do it? So I tried it. You know, it works. I mean, it's like I said, it's got disadvantages, but you know.
Yeah. I'll have to take another look at it and see what he's done. I've noticed that the fellow's been updating it. Because basically he doesn't need a loop in there. What you really want to do is wait on a semaphore in your Rin 3 code. And when the halt comes out, when the thing halts, it stops, and then when it comes off the halt, it goes to semaphore. Then you only loop as many times as you need. But of course the problem is the kernel, and that'll happen every time there's an interrupt on that system. That's the one problem with the halt. It helps, but it doesn't really shut you down totally.
Yeah.
See, what happens is where the SMP kernel is better than the halt driver makes the kernel think it has work to do. It sort of fools it, unfortunately. Yeah, it's running at idle priority and all that, but it's still running. It's still ready to run. It's not blocked. So what happens is it's going to use up more. It's actually going to keep. Yes, you'll get some halt, but the next interrupt you'll get unhalted. The way it's done now is better.
Okay.
When these CPUs are not busy, they just get idle and they stay halted, and the SMP kernel, there's just nothing there to do.
And this is also true for internally. The periodic interrupt is used to schedule threads. So you have a periodic interrupt in the system. Can you, because you just said the halt always is ended when you have an interrupt. Is this somehow solved differently?
No, that periodic interrupt may still happen. But I actually have to think about that. I don't really know that stuff that well, because it's possible that the kernel could, when it idles the CPU, could also idle that periodic interrupt and use some other mechanism like an ITI to turn the thing back on.
Okay.
Because I don't really, I think it's one of those things that when they did the SMP kernel, they weren't thinking of 4-core laptops running i7s.
Prep 01. Now, what that one was is people were like, well, it's not working under the DCPI. It only allows 15. In fact, this is the exact line in there. IRQ 15 equals 15. Why they didn't have max IRQ, but IRQ 15 equals 15. I took the easier approach and says, okay, IRQ 15 equals 48. That's and then recompile it.
I love these season. So fast.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you sit down, I mean, maybe I should change that to max IRQ, but I just love the fact it said IRQ 15 equals 15. It just, it's sharp and it's funny there. But that's all I had to do for that one to allow both, the higher IRQs to work it in. USB, mostly minor build issues that, Dr. Lars on says, well, how come this?
And Lars goes, because I changed it, didn't change it compatibly. It happens. L switcher. Now, most of the heavy lifting is done by Greg, but I've got, I work on the L switcher, build it, a few updates here or there, looking. I do a lot of time spending looking for the problem, trying to, getting close, and somebody else comes in there and says, oh, it's just this.
What's L switcher?
L switcher, actually, see if I can get out of this. L switcher is this is the standalone bar down here, but this bar is the standalone bar. It allows, it's a task switcher, It's also allows you to change priority on applications. It'll also run as a widget inside of eCenter or XCenter. This is like I said, I run the standalone. I think Greg runs it in the XCenter as an XCenter widget. But it does the same thing. I mean, it's got shows you the applications that are running. You can change between the applications, switch between the applications. You can close them. You can change the priority on them.
You're missing the Rdesktop, pressing Alt Tab to change.
Oh yeah, Alt Tab. I don't do that. I don't use that as much myself. But
Alt Tab, that menu is
so it replaces the Alt Tab. I don't use that one as often myself. Mine is supposed to be set up where when I get there, it doesn't go away. For some reason, it's switching. It's not supposed to be doing it. It's supposed to wait until I get in it.
That's a function of L switcher, that thing you just...
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. And
you have to try it again when your presentation isn't up, because I've noticed that thing seems to grab focus.
yeah, that may be what it's.
Especially this one's.
Yeah, and don't use the keyboard for that. The old version, 232 GA. It has tends to disappear.
Yeah. Well, this one's 411 here.
Yeah, I know. I'm bad boy. I haven't installed it yet.
But now what I did on that is I just took my 3.2. I removed my 3.2 and dumped my 411 files over so that all the associations and everything still
Right.
works. The same as it did before. But Mouse, and I got to give apologies to Martin because I still haven't finished putting the new licensing in there, gotten it back to him. But mostly that was just perseverance. I can't remember who was working on it originally. They said they couldn't get it. Christian? I can't remember. They couldn't get it. Basically, that one there was a function of it was originally built with CSET. And CSET used iLink 386. And I'm building, I probably have a copy somewhere, but I wouldn't want to look for it.
Why use it?
And why use it? So I'm using VAC at this point, and iLink, because Link 386 doesn't work with VAC, or at least I couldn't make it work with VAC. And it's a lot of change, it turns out, between Link 386 and
Well, the
iLink.
response files are totally different.
Yeah.
That's the kicker. Everything else, functionally, is very
The
similar.
libraries are different.
Oh yeah, you can't share libraries, but the namings aren't too bad. There's really not a lot of name changes.
But I had to switch to all those response files because I couldn't use the VAC library, so I had to make the switch to the iLink.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to expose my ignorance here.
Okay.
What is VAC?
VAC is Visual H Compiler.
Okay.
So that's IBM's C compiler. VAC.
Okay.
From
I started to get that glimmer a little bit ago. Maybe that's what it is. So, okay.
So that's what the original, when Mozilla was originally ported, that's what it was using. That's was one of the compilers was used for a lot of stuff back then, whereas today it's mostly Wacom or GCC. I probably, eventually Mouse should be ported over to Wacom, but we wanted to get the thing built so that we could get the thing open source to put the system.
What is Mouse?
Mouse actually is animated mouse pointers. So it's been around for, I don't know, since 98 or 96 or something like that. I can't remember how long, it might have been 96. Basically, you can have, like on Windows you see like the galloping horses. That's the type of mouse that has the animations that this mouse.
Okay. Yeah, there was one of the computers in the setup. It had a bird that would fly wings or some such.
So it's that's what the Mouse is. And I got the thing, finally got it wrote. It's just a perseverance going through there, finding out what changes do I have to make to these response files, and going through all of them and getting them switched over.
Okay, I've got one other question.
Yes.
And I don't know who to ask the question of, so all I want you to tell me is who to ask the question of. This computer has a touchpad, and it's got the track point, and I like to use the track point and scroll up and down with the track point, right, with the center button. My earlier mouse drivers had the ability to set how you scroll and all that sort of thing.
You probably installed the A mouse drivers.
That's where that is.
Well, it's the problem.
Oh,
They don't work well with the ThinkPad, the trackpad. So you probably need to go back, instead use the IBM's single mouse driver. That's an
Okay,
old
but that
assumption.
doesn't have the ability to, somewhere along the line, I've lost the ability to control the scroll and all that
Yeah,
stuff.
That's an installation problem for your WPS objects.
Yeah.
Now, that probably has to do with the fact that you're trying to switch between A mouse and S mouse. If you get on one of the...
Where's is S mouse on it? I've got
It's on your install CD.
2.2.
Yeah, it's on your install CD, and you can actually select it during installation.
But it defaults to
And
A mouse.
The default is A mouse, and you want to uncheck that, so.
Yeah, but you don't have to reinstall. Someone can help you find the WPI on the CD, and you just uninstall one mouse, install the other, and with luck, maybe you have to check. Look, everybody has different systems. People don't clean their WPSs. Even after using OS2 for 20 years, I find people, they forget that, oh yeah, you have to clean the WPS. It's not self-repairing. So, you can't say until you actually start looking at the problem, but more than likely, your solution is, first of all, also, do you like to use the touchpad or not?
I can't stand it.
Okay, that you can probably
Go to BIOS, kill it.
Yeah.
Well, that I've done. Okay.
Yeah.
Because it kept jumping me to places I didn't want to be.
Listen, I have palms. The problem is when I type, I tend to type low, and my mouse moves. So the
Yeah.
touchpad went off on anything I use. If I never put the type like that.
Yeah. Okay.
But the thing is, it sounds like you have a conflict.
Yeah, the big thing.
You see the same type of thing when people try to switch between Snap and Panorama. They don't always get the screen object, where it goes in some weird place. And this is the same thing. The notebooks are there. It's a matter of getting them so they appear at the right place and the right time. And that's what mostly WPS cleanup, which you do with the installation. But post one of the lists, like, I don't know, ECS Technical or something like that, and they'll walk you through it.
The WPS cleanup.
Pardon? We don't know yet. It's going to take a little analysis to actually know what's broken.
Okay. The problem with posting to a list for me is I'm too stupid to ask the question.
Don't worry about it. It's always an iterative process. There will be a better ticketing system in the future. Doesn't exist. One that's used right now, maintained, doesn't exist, but it's coming.
I didn't mean to hijack the thing.
No,
I just
I didn't get finished up though for the next one, so. All right, so. He's still writing it.
almost done.
All right, these are some other things I've worked on, but I haven't really made contributions to. But what happens though is that you go out there and I built Samba because I needed that. I needed some of the updates that were needed, so I just needed Samba for myself. X Workplace I used to build, and I haven't built it in a long time. I used to build the X Workplace and get the newest updates that we put in at that time CBS, before they were released. Various Nix ports, some of them for build, so I could do other builds because you sit there and go to build one thing and then you got to build 3 other things so that you get the one thing that you wanted built. And then it turns out that those 3 other things needed 4 other things for each of them. So. Build some of those, and sometimes you end up building a whole bunch of stuff, and then you run into a dead end. You can't build the one thing you were really wanting in the first place. But you go through building those. NEPMD, I built that one. I was hoping to get rid of some problems that I think it's system problems is what they actually are. But I was hoping that maybe building the latest ones would clean some of that up. And back, in the virtual box, and there's various others. But like I said, it does a couple of things. So as you build these things, it tests your build environment to see if you've got a problem in your build environment. It also tests, maybe it's not a problem in your built environment, maybe it's the fact that somebody, is working on their system because, well, yeah, they've done this other thing that they've forgotten about, 3 years ago, so it works on their system, but it doesn't work on anybody else's when they go to build it or whatever. So basically, though, what I want to do, go through this, is because none of these were really big things that I did. None of this was huge. I mean, some of it took me a lot of time to do it, but it's, I was wanting to spend time. But the thing to take away is that, many hands make light work. So you don't have to make a huge contribution. You sit there and you start working on small things and just what interests you. You start building it. You go out there and say, okay, I'm interested in the L switcher, for instance. So you go out there and you start looking at it. So is there something that building it first? Just build it. Didn't have to. At first, you're not even necessarily looking to fix anything necessarily. You're looking at just trying to get your build environment working, making sure taking. Sometimes one of them that's suggested is I've never actually built this one myself. They suggest my mind's gone lost again. They suggest building. Now I'm totally lost. Anyhow, there's one out there that everybody says, "Oh, go build this one," and that's not a bad one to choose. It's just something to set up and make sure that you just want to choose something simple. And sometimes maybe start with simple and then make a little find something a little more complex. But just find something you're interested in. Don't go out there and looking to try to go out there. Now, if you're a full-blown programmer, you go out there and say, "Okay, I'm going to go fix Perl." That's fine. But if you don't know, if you're not a programmer, you don't want to go out there. You probably don't want to start with saying, "I'm going to go fix Perl." If you're a programmer, that's fine. But if you're just sitting there,
Don't listen to them.
but you go out there and find something that you're interested in. I mean, if the only thing you're interested in is fixing Perl, by all means, start there. I don't care. It's your time. But usually you want to fix, if you're just starting, you want to find something simple to make sure that you've got everything set up, to make sure that you know how all your tools are working. And like I said, but just find something that interests you. Now, one of the things you can also do is I read all the time. So, well, I'm not a programmer, but I can test. I'm not a programmer, but I can test. And you see that all the time. So, well, if you want to test, go out there and build it, and then you can test it. Just go out there.
Well, this is an excellent corollary to something I've probably been saying for 15 years. If OS2 wants to survive, the end users have to be developers. Doesn't mean they have to start from scratch, but they have to do developer-like things. They can't just say, "I don't program," because there's just not enough developers around to get things done.
Yeah.
And most of the big things that have been done, got done because the users started acting like developers. The thing that they need testing that's needed because you take a look at Paul's stuff, he's a volume developer, right? But his stuff is always distributed with minimal testing or less.
Yeah.
Because I built it last night, got to go to work, build cars now, and out it comes and we test it for it.
Yeah.
And we feed it back, and it's an effective way of doing things.
Yeah.
There's one more thing that we need is people who can write installation, documentation, yes.
Unfortunately,
Really need documentation.
it's a wishful thought, and it's not going to happen. This is another reason why you're better to build it yourself than sort of.
No, you see, you're missing my point. I'm not saying I want the developers to write the documentation, but we need other people in the group who maybe they can't develop, but they can write.
For some reason, we don't have a large quantity of them either.
One thing like the GCC compiler, many times I've downloaded that thing, but I'm never clear on that thing. Like, if you download the 4. whatever version, do you still need older versions installed?
Yes.
Like, that's like really confusing. Like, why is that? You can't just use it the way you know.
I'll tell you why it's not. Because it's not a commercial product.
No, I understand, but would it be a
that's
huge
the answer.
project to pull the parts out of the older one into the newer one so you only have to do one thing instead of
But
three?
David,
Like
that's the
Lib
answer. But see, that is the answer. And the problem is, you can fight your way upstream, Or you can just go with the flow. You install 2 of them. When you're done, it's installed, and it works.
But actually, now,
Spend more time
but there is
complaining
another-
about the fact that it's different.
And is that in some document somewhere in that stuff you download?
Yeah, but there is another way of doing it now. You go out there and get RPM, install Yum, and say Yum install GCC splat and let it go through.
And that'll work?
That's a Yum. That's a Yum.
And you'll get Smedley's compiled?
Yeah, I know.
Everything we have is a work in progress. Everything we have.
Yeah, right.
But the thing is, it's as likely to work as going out there and saying, okay, I'm going to download this, I'm going to install it, put this over it, and if you're not careful, you can run into problems
Yeah,
anyhow.
see, you gotta be realistic. You know, I follow what's going on. I take a look at the Mozilla check-ins, okay? And weekly, the Firefox gets about 500 check-ins a week, okay? Think about how many people that means. Now, about half of that's automated. So figure about 200 of those check-ins are people that are writing code, reviewed, tested on the tinderbox, they're making sure there's no regressions and all that. Simply not going to happen for OS2. Okay? Plus, you've also got people, a whole bunch of people that are doing the Mozilla websites and all that. There's probably a couple hundred people doing that. That stuff is just a different world. If you expect that world, basically you waste your time complaining that it doesn't exist because it's not going to change. Saying it should exist is not going to change it. So, and the thing is, what we have is workable, but it's going to take, you have to be flexible and you have to accept the work presence.
But basically though, most of the stuff as you go through it, it's just logic. And you sit there and say, you know, what is it doing? You know, and you're looking at the logical flow. And that's where the majority of it. www searches to figure out, okay, you know, why is this not working? What should I do? How does this work? Blah, 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 whatever it is that you're needing. And perseverance. And that's probably the biggest thing. Is to just persevere and just sit there and just keep at it until you figure out, oh, okay, that's what that is. And then you hope you remember it the next time, but of course it's been long enough you don't have to open it up again. But after a while you start, some of this stuff gets easier. I mean, but most of it, you don't have to be a programmer. It's not a function of being a programmer. Like Union, for instance, is a prime example. I just went through there and built it. Okay, I've got it built. Now I'm going to go and I'm going to take out what they did. I'm going to take out this change. I'm going to take this change out. I'm going to take this change out until I found which change.
Taking out the first change is hard. It's a learning process. After that, you're doing the same thing over and over again. It gets easier.
And then, that's a lot of times what you're doing. That in itself, somebody, they're going in and they're making these updates to, we'll say Firefox. Now I haven't seen this particular thing, but let's say Firefox, you notice that something suddenly is not working the way it was. You go from one version to the next. Now, the problem is that there's such a big release of them, so it gets to be difficult. But you can sit there, if you're building the thing, you can go in there, look for, first of all, look at the possible changes. You can look down through the changes a lot of times to know that even if without being a programmer, you can read the thing, their comments, and realize this isn't going to likely affect it. Now, sometimes it is what affected it, but largely you're going to say this didn't affect it, this didn't affect it, this didn't affect it. So it brings down the number of possibilities. So you can look at it, maybe you've got a few possibilities, but you only have to back out a few of them. Now, you back those out and it's not it, and you're back up reevaluating the others. But a lot of times you can sit there just reading the comments and say, these wouldn't have affected that. And you go and back out the ones until you find the one that didn't cause it. And you sit there and build this, okay, this is the thing. Then you can put in a ticket that says, this change right here causes this issue. Now, Mozilla is a big animal as an example, but that's, you can do that with, anything that's out there that you sit there, it worked here, it doesn't work with this release, and you can sit there and instead of sitting there saying this doesn't work, and maybe it works, it's only because there's some specific change in there that affects your system because of other applications or other system setup that you have, that the programmers go, it works for me, So you back that out and you figure out, say, this is the problem. And you may not know why it's a problem, you may not know the correct fix for it. But you can say, this is what broke it. Then they can go in there and say, oh, this is probably why it broke. You know.
And that saves somebody a lot of time, because the analysis work is the most time consuming, often.
And that's what I do more of than anything else, really, is analysis type stuff. And a lot of times, like I said, it takes me a long time to figure it out versus somebody else. If they had the time to do it, it wouldn't take them as long, but they can't recreate it, or they just don't have the time to take those few minutes. But
You're over time.
I'm over time, so.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'm basically, I'm done anyway, unless there's something else that somebody wants to. So.